Welcome to The Outsider, where some of our favourite GB News commentators have the chance to sound off on an issue important to them, often being overlooked by the rest of the media. Now, deadlines, editors' notes, dismissive Amazon reviews, today's authors certainly have enough to worry about without fear of cancellation. But the threat weighed heavily enough on best-selling author Sebastian Faulk's mind that he purposefully avoided, wait for this, describing the female protagonist of his latest book, Snow Country, after a reader of his 2018 novel, Paris Echo, challenged whether he had the right to speak about a woman and write about a woman. Speaking at the Cheltenham Literature Festival, the Birdsong writer said of the challenge, "I thought about it a lot. It is not seen through the male gaze. You do get an idea of what she looks like, but only through what her female friend says to her and what she says when looking at herself in the mirror." Well, tonight's Outsider, commentator and broadcaster Emma Webb thinks we need to close this chapter of cancel culture and throw the book at anyone who tries policing writers' imagination. I mean, Emma Webb, this literally made me so furious, and it made me so angry, actually, as well, that Sebastian Faulks had given into this. Because, Emma, let's just think about this practically. If, as authors, we can only write about folk who have the same shared experience of us, that means you're going to get segregated books. You're going to get books that are only about straight white men or gay white men or lesbian black women. It is bonkers.
It's extremely sad, and I think it's quite obvious that this is going to impoverish literature. The fact that someone of Sebastian Faulks' stature, he wrote Birdsong, a very famous book, he's an exceptional writer. The fact that he said that he feels liberated by his decision to no longer describe female characters. In his latest book, as you say, he's decided not to do this. And I think that that's very sad. And actually, it makes sense in context, given that Sebastian Faulks is, as they would say, an old white male. He's in his 60s, and he's writing in a context where we have seen the rise of sensitivity readers, people who professionally are hired by publishing houses to go through books and cancel-proof them, to check that there are no racist stereotypes in there. And ultimately where this goes is a kind of radical subjectivism, where people are only able to write about the identity categories that they belong to, identity categories that haven't necessarily been decided by them, but are foisted on them by this framework of identity politics. And ultimately, really, you can only, by that logic, write about things that are autobiographical. And I think that this is really going to impoverish literature, and it's going to leave future generations wondering what otherwise writers like Sebastian Faulks would have written if they hadn't have felt so afraid or hesitant to write about people who were outside of their identity group. And I think it's very sad.
No, I think you're completely right. It's incredibly sad. And now, Emma, is it correct that students at a particular university are being told that they can't use certain words in their writing?
So this is, again, another sign that they get them early when it comes to policing language. Aston University wrote to the Free Speech Union, a student of Aston University even wrote to the Free Speech Union, expressing a concern about something that they had been handed from the Social Sciences and Humanities Department. And this was guidance for undergraduates that gave lists of, quite expansive lists of words and phrases that the students were not allowed to use. This included things that were regarded as sexist, things like founding fathers, man on the street, layman, referring to the mentally ill. They said instead should be referred to as mental health service users, which isn't quite actually the same thing as being mentally ill, and special needs being referred to as additional needs, things like this. Not using the word native in certain contexts. And you'll hate this one particularly, Dan, that the guide also said that the word British could, and this is a quote, imply a false sense of unity. And so in a way, they problematize even using the word British. So there's a whole host of things in here that are no-goes for the students. And the concern is that they also say that this list is not exhaustive. So there's a suggestion there that the list could change in the future, and therefore I imagine students would be very concerned that they could retroactively be punished for using the wrong words, which is something that we also see in the atmosphere going back to Sebastian Faulks and the sensitivity checkers. If we remember authors like Kate Clancy or even Sally Rooney, who were criticised after the fact for using what some people felt was problematic language. I can imagine that students in a sort of atmosphere like this would feel that they were concerned that words that they use that are not in that guidance may at some future point be problematized. And so the Free Speech Union wrote to Aston University asking them for clarification and to assure students that they wouldn't be penalized for using any of the language in this guidance. So again, as we saw with authors in the publishing world as well as in universities, there is this move, and we've been on this trajectory for some time, of creating linguistic codes, words and phrases that people are not allowed to use. One of the ones, obviously, in relation to Kate Clancy, was almond-shaped eyes. And there was another book that used the phrase almond-shaped eyes that was apparently sent back to the sensitivity checkers before being published. So I think this is something that should really worry us, because as Dawn French and Bernardine Evaristo pointed out in relation to Sebastian Faulks, that they felt that this was ridiculous, and that actually this is going to limit people's imaginations. And, to misquote and probably butcher Orwell's sentiment, the limits of your language are the limits of your world. They're the limits of what you're able to describe, what you're able to imagine, and how you're able to transport people through literature. And what this does is it sort of destroys the universalism that makes literature so magical, that allows people to transcend themselves and imagine themselves in someone else's shoes. And I think that this is actually a disaster for art, and it's a disaster for academia as well. And it's really going to impoverish the minds of the next generation, as well as we see, established authors.
No, indeed. And it's interesting, Emma, that you mention Sally Rooney, the author of books like Normal People, because she is caught up in her own scandal, freedom of speech scandal, over a decision to refuse to allow her new novel to be published in Hebrew due to her views on the Israel-Palestine crisis. What's going on there?
This, again, is very sad. Sally Rooney is, she's well known to be on the left, which is why it was so surprising, although I guess not, because many people on the left do get cancelled, but so surprising to see her being criticised in the way that she was for in this review that I mentioned before. Sally Rooney is a supporter of a cultural boycott of Israel. And so this scandal has been reported on by Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, and one of her previous books have been translated into Hebrew, Normal People, and her second book also. And when the publisher, the Hebrew publisher, contacted her agent about a new translation into Hebrew of her most recent book, they were informed that there would be no translation because Sally Rooney is boycotting Israel. But in doing so, rather than by doing this through a cultural boycott, by refusing to have her book made accessible to Israeli readers, what she's actually doing is taking action not against the Israeli government, not a boycott against the politics, but actually depriving the Israeli people and people who read only Hebrew, which I imagine are actually a very few number. So I'm not sure. I think surely she's actually shooting herself in the foot a little here, rather than actually making much of a point, because most Israelis read English and many other languages as well. But what she's doing here really is trying to make it so that Israelis are not able to access her literature as a punishment for the political situation in Israel, which is, I think, very troubling.